Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this final plenary session of this year's Congress. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have Eliana Laferrara, who's going to talk about media and behavioral change, unpacking social effects. Eliana is someone whose work I've admired since I first met her, probably just shortly after she graduated from Harvard. She's worked in a range of fields, in political economy, in development, and as what we're going to hear about today is a new strand of work, which I don't know quite how you describe it, on related to behavioral economics, and it's really a very exciting research agenda. Eliana has a fistful of papers in really top journals, but I think that those things always sort of understate people's achievements. It's the content that is most exciting, the kinds of topics, the originality, I think, in her work that I find particularly exciting. And of course she has, not surprisingly, been recognized for her achievements, not least by being elected president of the European Economic Association. So Eliana, we're absolutely delighted you're going to talk to us this morning. Welcome.
Thanks a lot. It's a privilege to be here. I'm a little intimidated because the list of plenary speakers that preceded me is really impressive, and I can assure you without any hesitation that I'm at the bottom, not just in temporal sequence, but quality-wise. Yet I try to live up at least to a fraction of what Tim said about me, which was very, very kind. Yeah, I want to thank him and the organizers for allowing me to be here. So what I want to do today is indeed try to talk about a series of projects that I've been engaged with recently, but also not so recently, that basically take the media as a tool for development policy. So this all started considering what's been happening in developing countries in recent decades. And the graph that you see shows you TV ownership rates in a number of sub-Saharan African countries. You see growth rates of these ownership fractions between a factor of 1 to 5 in the space of 20 years. So really, there's a massive investment that households are making in trying to connect to the outside world, more and more through the internet, but in many places still through television. And if you compare this to the evolution over time of other variables that we care about, like, for example, secondary school achievement, although there are increasing trends in these variables as well, the speed at which this type of capital is accumulated is much slower. So the idea when seeing this type of data is that maybe, given how rapidly TV is spreading in the developing world, we can use it as a vehicle for development policy. And this is especially appealing when you consider how hard it's been to change behavior through traditional campaigns. So behavior change campaigns in areas related to fertility, HIV, gender-based violence have found it extremely difficult to have significant effects because these are supposed to be very deep parameters that people maybe are not so willing to change, and also it's unclear whether the information we're giving is enough or if there are other social and psychological factors that we should consider more. And so there's a recent move in the policy world towards media-based approaches and what's been called for some time edutainment or educational entertainment. And what I want to do is to start from what we've learned over time on the effects of media on social behavior, but then try to transition relatively quickly to these more recent policy approaches and what could be the theoretical and empirical underpinnings and evidence that we have in favor of them or against them. So what I'll do, I'll start with an overview of the literature that has looked at commercial television program, nothing educational, but still with important impacts on behavior, and then tell you a little bit why people have believed that this edutainment approach might work. And I'll try to spend the bulk of my time talking about social effects and how to combine this individual exposure to information with everything else that conditions our behavior, in particular, peer groups, conformity, and so on. So I'll try to present a simple model that might help us frame ideas, and then some experimental evidence from recent work that I've been doing in Nigeria on one of these educational TV series that's called Sugar, and finally conclude with some open. So what do we know about commercial TV and behavior change? Well, we can think that whenever we watch television or we are exposed to media, this will affect socioeconomic outcomes, first of all, because programs provide information on what the economic environment is, what opportunities are available. Also, it changes our preferences. It makes us want to aspire to some things that we see on television. And finally, it might absorb a good portion of our time. So simply time use could be related to what happens. And the economic literature has looked at these things with a bit of difficulty in really isolating causal impacts, because whenever you ask somebody whether they've watched the program, clearly this responds to their own taste. So we don't want to use actual viewing when we do this type of analysis. And what the literature has done is mainly relied on two sources of identification. One comes from TV networks that enter in different places in a staggered way, and the other instead comes from geography and variation in the quality of signal reception that comes, for example, from the presence of mountains and other geographic obstacles. So I'll start with a quick overview of some work that I've been doing on Brazilian media, in particular on soap operas that are called novelas in Brazil. And this work, the first time I started working on this problem was with Alberto Chong and Suzanne Durea, trying to look at fertility change in Brazil in the light of this television program. So what happened in Brazil was that since the mid-60s, Rede Globo, which is a huge conglomerate, media conglomerate in the country, entered more and more municipalities, and anecdotal evidence coming from anthropologists and sociologists doing case studies started associating the type of families and programs that were displayed on TV with changes in families' preferences. So Alberto and Suzanne and I decided to try and be a bit more systematic and collect data to see whether we could indeed estimate the effect of the availability of this program on fertility change. And what's important when you think about these type of novellas is that they were a bit particular in the way they portrayed female characters. So that was a period, let's say mid-60s to mid-70s, when where the total fertility rate in Brazil was between 6 and 5. And we did some content analysis of these novellas, and it turned out that basically for about 10 years, the main female character that you could see in prime time had either no children at all or just one child. So first of all, women were seeing characters that were very different in the number of children they had. Also, only about a third of them was married, and about 13% were separated or divorced. So they were clearly a bit, at a distance from the reality of Brazilian society at the time. And what we want to see is whether this combination of seeing small families on television and maybe stories that were appealing for the population might have induced them to desire small families themselves. Okay? So we've exploited this staggered entry across municipalities, and what we found was that immediately, the year after the availability of this program in a municipality, fertility rates started declining. And the magnitude of this effect, so having these programs available, was comparable to the type of reduction that 2 more years of education for a woman would give you. So it was actually quite a big effect. Also, the effect was stronger for poorer and less educated women, which I think points to one of the potentials of this type of means, because compared to standard education that relies on literacy, at least to some extent, these media programs are very accessible even to people who are less educated. Now, we also try to look at whether it's just television or the content of the programs that mattered, and we found, first of all, that if you look at the names of the children born in those years, they were more likely to be named after characters in the novellas if the family lived in a city where the program was available. Also, we found that this impact and decrease in fertility was sharper after years in which the message was particularly appealing. For example, because it portrayed a story of upward mobility, or because the woman that you were seeing on TV was close in age to the woman whose fertility we were analyzing. So basically, these are all characteristics that change year to year depending on the plot. And consistently, we find that whenever viewers can identify better, for example, because they are close in age, the response in terms of fertility reduction is strong. Okay? And there's similar evidence that we've produced also looking at divorce rate. Now, ongoing work that I'm doing with Alberto Chong, Claudio Ferraz, Fred Finan, and Luis Meloni tries to still use these novellas, but now move to something different, which is political preference. And this is something that may not be obvious because there's a very broad literature on media and politics, but all of that literature has focused on media bias in providing political news. And that was also a little bit how we started the project as well, because those of you who are familiar with the history of the dictatorship in Brazil will know that the common wisdom is that Rede Globo was actually supporting the dictatorship. There are stories about, evening news being twisted to favor the authoritarian party and so on. So what we've done was to, apply a similar strategy, looking at municipalities and years where the network went or didn't go, but also consider what was happening together with the evening news in the provision of entertainment content. Okay? And our question is, what happens overall to support for the dictatorship as proxied by the electoral share of the pro-regime party, which was called Arena at the time. And despite being a dictatorship, Brazil had direct election for mayors in all cities except state capitals. So why is this non-trivial? Because while everybody has focused on the fact that the evening news and also the newspaper that Globo produced were distorted in their content, people have overlooked the fact that what Globo was showing in the novellas was going in a completely different direction. And this is a bit an accident of history, because due to the censorship at the time, left-wing writers could not publish books, and they ended up scripting for TV producers, in particular for these novellas. So you have excellent writers like Diaz Gomez, who ended up being hired by Rede Globo because they could produce very good novellas and draw in a large audience, but whose ideas were extremely progressive. And in fact, there was a back and forth in censorship over those years, and a lot of these messages remain despite the censorship. Okay? So what we found in the end was that, contrary to expectations, when Globo is present in the municipalities, the vote share of this pro-dictatorship party, instead of going up, goes down. Okay? And also, there's more likely to be an opposition candidate. And again, there is suggestive evidence that the content of this entertainment program had played a role. Why? Because when we see years in which the novella was censored for political reasons, those years and municipalities covered are more likely to respond in terms of negative vote shares. And also, we coded whether corruption, elections, and so on were featured in the content. And indeed, we found that electoral impacts were stronger in those years. Okay? So overall, Brazil, which is the case I know best in terms of these commercial TV programs, does seem to suggest that there is a really extensive range of behaviors and preferences on which this type of entertainment program have an impact. There's other work that's also very well known that goes in a consistent direction. One is the paper by Jensen and Austria on women empowerment in India. For those of you who don't know it, basically they look at what cable TV does to preferences on gender outcomes, including some preference, girls' education, gender-based violence. And they find that in villages where cable becomes available, the exposure to more Western-type values changes people's preferences and behavior. And more recently, Melissa Kearney and Phil Levine have looked at an MTV reality show called 16 and Pregnant. Some of you might have seen it, and have argued that it has contributed by almost 1/3 to recent decreases in teen pregnancy rates in the US. Why? Because the picture you see of these teenagers going through, pain and being dumped by their boyfriend and, dealing with delivery and all of the complications associated seems to have dissuaded some US teenagers from engaging in unprotected sex. So overall, what we can say is that none of what I've discussed was designed with the intention of affecting fertility or electoral outcomes or any of those things, but it led to changes. And so what could be a world where not only we use entertainment media, but we try and optimize, we try and maximize the way in which content allows us to achieve the desired impact. And educational entertainment tries to do precisely that, tries to create education programs that employ role models in the media in a way that promotes socially desirable behaviors and discourages socially undesirable ones. Okay? So where does the theory for this come from? Most people agree that Albert Bandura, a famous psychologist, really is at the core of the principles that have animated edutainment practitioners. First of all, Bandura's social learning theory is a pillar because he basically theorized that individuals learn not only through direct exposure, but also through the experience of others. So what you can do with media is basically reduce the cost of learning. Show what happens if you make a mistake without you having to directly bear the cost of that mistake. Also, what Bandura put forward is this concept of self-efficacy, which is the belief in the fact that you're capable to organize and execute actions that are required to manage your future. And so, in a sense, what these programs do is to present individuals with similar characteristics to the viewers who succeed in reaching their goals. And this will induce viewers to consider the goals as feasible for themselves. Okay? And because we are in Mexico, I cannot but mention Miguel Sabido, who's really, together with Bandura, the father of edutainment. And Sabido applied these theories to a large number of telenovelas already in the early days that Televisa put forward with educational purposes. So what he did in his programs was, first of all, employ role modeling in a way that every production would show positive, negative, and transitional characters. And the transitional ones are the especially important ones, because these are the people who, most of us identify with, not the angels, not the devils, those in between. And you see that they start off well and then make mistakes, or start off badly and then correct, but these are all situations that you can encounter yourself. Second, identification means that when you design one of these programs, you want to have situations that are close enough that people can actually connect and don't see instead the opportunity set as completely disjoint from the one that's available to themselves. And finally, exemplification is very important. So in all of this, you will see hidden in the plot almost a kind of teaching style method of how to deal with situations. So you have to offer concrete steps that people can follow and where they can find information. So why do we think that this differs from existing behavior change campaign? Is it anything new? So first of all, because very often these behavior change campaigns try to give information and lots of it, okay? And as you see, this in point 3 on the screen, these lots of information can create an overload that leads people to basically discard everything at once. So when you have one of these programs, necessarily you have a certain number of minutes, you have to pick your messages and be selective. And this means that there will be fewer concepts that people have, a greater ability to assimilate. But also, as we said before, this role modeling and identification plays a big role. First of all, to demonstrate what's available, but also to reduce what's called counter-arguing. So counter-arguing happens, and those of you who are parents know very well, when you try and tell someone, this is what's good for you. Believe me, I know, and now you don't think it will be good, but you need to trust me. And immediately, as someone perceives that you're trying to teach them a lesson, they will raise some barriers. They will just try to protect their own views, and they will say, no, look, I don't want to be patronized. I have my own ideas, I've thought about it, and I'll do it my way. So what happens with these programs is that there's never the blatant objective of persuading anyone. Actually, if there is an educational message, it's subtle and it's hidden somewhere. So people are immediately drawn to the plot, are drawn to the intrigue, to the gossip, to everything that they see as relatively innocuous. And then this way their defenses are not up, and when the message comes, they can be receptive. Okay? So this is actually something that traditional behavior change campaigns have completely, disregarded, because they present themselves as, we come in to tell you what would be good for you. And it might not have the desired effect. Now, there's one part of what this edutainment program does, which I believe has been a little bit less studied and less stressed, which is that not only they give you information, role models and everything, but they also make you think that certain behaviors are socially acceptable. So suddenly, when you see something on television, you update what you think the rest of society does. You update what an acceptable social norm might be. So you will see the application I'll show you for the edutainment experiment. It's about HIV prevention. You want to tell people that they need to be protected if they have sex, and in a context like Nigeria, wearing a condom is a completely uncool thing to do. So if this program shows you very cool characters who are DJs and young hip people who instead do it, maybe you will update the social. Actually, we find that unfortunately it didn't happen, but the possibility was that you could update the social norm of what a cool guy looks like. Okay? Maybe it's not true that cool guys don't wear. So on this edutainment, for many years there's been a lot of production and a lot of excitement based on case studies or before-after types of analysis. And more recently, we've had solid experimental evidence. One of the papers that I think has very credible results is on financial education in South Africa, where in the mid of a very popular soap called Scandal, they introduced a subplot related to gambling and hire purchase agreement, and they basically found that the viewers who were randomly encouraged to watch it decreased the use of these types of agreements, improved financial knowledge. Another trial that was done was related to public policy, and in particular to the public works program in India and Rega. And here the intention was to increase take-up, which was quite low in Bihar, the state where this was done. And the way in which it was accomplished was by basically showing in villages a short 25 minutes movie with a story about a migrant not needing to go to the city because he could find work on site. And what they found, the authors found, was that indeed knowledge about eligibility improved, perceptions improved, but actual usage did not. So it already shows you some limitations which have to do with the gap between giving information and changing knowledge, and then making the step to change your own behavior. Maybe the reason it didn't change is that other people did not expect that the rest of the village would show up and claim work as they were supposed to. And finally, there's a few studies that have used similar short media programs to work on the concept of aspirations. One, which is the one you see on the screen, will be presented this afternoon in a session on aspirations. And here, the authors showed short documentaries containing success stories about farmers and local business people from the community, and found that aspirations and investments in children education improved. And then another interesting experiment that was done in Tanzania with young, basically high school students, was to try and foster entrepreneurship, again by showing success stories. And the authors found that business creation went up a lot. Interestingly, if you look at the effect of on education of the two interventions, it was quite opposite. The first one targeted adults. So what happened was that parents, seeing those stories, even though they did not explicitly mention education, decided to try and do something for their kids. The second one targeted young people. And because they did not mention the importance of education to be a good entrepreneur, what these young people did was to put all their effort and time into businesses and neglect their schoolwork. So this tells you again that one of the advantages of these approaches, which is you select information, you show a small subset of what could be potentially valuable, if you don't pick the subset very carefully, might backfire. You didn't mention that schooling was important, and they did worse in school. In the program on India, on NREGA, the story about the migrant featured a man, and then what happened was that people in treatment villages thought that the program was not available for women, which it was, but simply you couldn't have two plots going parallel. So I'm not saying that you can deal with everything with these types of programs, but a careful design hopefully would minimize these unintended effects. And finally, Betsy Paluk, who's been worked on this for quite some time, has looked at the effect of these media on social norms, and what she found was that it's easy enough to change prescriptive norms. So to convince people of what should be done, she did it in the context of Rwanda, you should trust people. You should have intermarriage among ethnic groups. But when you go to descriptive norms, do people actually behave this way? Media don't seem to affect those perceptions. So again, there is a clear obstacle when you want to go from the individual perception to behavior change and social change. So to sum up, I think one could view the available body of evidence as one where individual attitudes or behavioral change have been quite studied. Social norms, a lot less. And where the missing link is one where we acknowledge that the impact of such an educational message will not only depend on how you yourself perceive it, but on how you believe that your reference group will react to that message. Okay? So think about a world where there is both learning. I learn from TV, I learn from my peers, but also there is conformity. I don't want to deviate from too much from what society expects. Now, in this world, how to design media programs and what impact they will have is not obvious. Okay? So what we'll do next is to try and put this piece together and understand social effects in edutainment. So to do this, I'll rely on something that is work in progress. It's joint work with Abhijit Banerjee and Victor Orozco, and it's an evaluation of the MTV series Sugar that I'll tell you about in a minute in Nigeria. Now, what we wanted to do with this evaluation was, first of all, have kind of a very simple message, did it work or not? But also for us, it was more interesting to take these information versus conformity effects seriously and design the intervention to try and measure both. So what is Sugar? Sugar is, so what I'll do is actually, I'll start with the theory we had in mind for how learning and conformity might interact. And then I will tell you about the show and about the different treatments that we did and the evidence we produced. So what's this model? It's really pretty basic. You think that individuals have to choose one action, and there is a choice that's objectively correct. We're going to call it Y star. And there's also an average choice in your reference group, which is the capital Y. Plus, you have your own idiosyncratic preference A. So as an individual, what I want to do is I want to minimize my deviation from the correct choice, the choice of others, and my own preferred point. Okay? So I'm maximizing a utility function that has these three components. This will mean that my optimal action should be a weighted average of this correct choice, the average in the population, and my preference. And because I don't know what the true values of those variables are, I use my priors. So people have priors on what the correct action might be, small s, priors on what others are doing, we call it small r, and we assume normality for all of this. And then we use this to model how exposure to sugar, which is our edutainment program, changes priors and behavior. So very simply, you can think of two periods. The first period before we show the program and the other after. And in the first period, you will simply choose an action which weighs your prior about the correct choice, the social prior, and the preference. And for the control group, nothing else will happen because they will not be shown at the edutainment program. So in the second period, all they will have is basically some adjustment that might depend on time variation in the preferences, and which we model as an AR1 process. So the choice of the control group in T1 is quite standard. For the treatment, what happens is that when we show them a new program, we're telling them something about, first of all, what the correct choice should be. So after seeing the show, an individual will get an extra signal about Y star. And so with the simple Bayesian updating, you have that, I don't know which one I should indicate. Basically, you are now weighting the two signals, the one you had before and the new one that you get through the program, and everything else is there. So what you can do with this type of machinery is very simply take these predicted choices as being potential outcomes, take the difference, and take conditional expectation, conditional on your baseline choice, which yields an expression where the difference between the treatment and the control group will be a function of these two priors and your baseline position, and which has an estimating equation counterpart that looks like this. So basically, this is what I want you to remember because I will use it in the empirics. Your choice in the second period after watching sugar will be a function of a number of individual controls that we're going to include, a treatment dummy, your baseline choice, so this was the same variable measured before we showed you the program, and then the interaction between the treatment dummy and the baseline. Okay? So I'll show you results for this specification, and in order for the program to be effective, we want the coefficient on this treatment dummy to be significant, and the interaction with the baseline will be typically negative because it's basically reversed. Now, what we did in our intervention was not simply to show an educational series. We reinforced it in a way that was trying to really make focal and topical the role of the reference. Okay? So basically, what we did was follow the projection of the TV series with what we called announcements that are interviews and statistics about other people's reaction to the show. And I'll be precise about how we did it. But you can think then of this second treatment as sugar plus announcement. And in the model, what this does is to provide an additional signal, which this time is about capital Y. So this signal is about how the rest of the people are going to choose their action after seeing sugar. Okay? And so you basically can derive the form for this signal from the individual responses of each of the members in this reference group. And then, let me skip through the analytics, come to a specification where if you are in the second treatment, your outcome in the second period is going to depend on the treatment dummy, your baseline position, and the new stuff is this difference which we could call surprise. It's basically what you thought ex ante about other people's opinions or actions, and how we instead shocked you with these new information, statistics, and interviews, which could be a positive shock if we gave you a higher values than you had before, or a negative shock. Okay? So for understanding these social effects, I will show you a specification where not only I have the simple treatment dummies, but I also look at how the extra message that we provided consisted in an improvement or a deterioration of your prior from the point of view of the message that the program was trying to do. So what's this program? If you're curious, you can watch it on the Suga website. It's produced by MTV International, and it's now, I think, in season 5. We evaluated season 3. It talks about young people, first in Kenya, the one we evaluate in Nigeria, and now it's in South Africa. The common theme is that they're all urban people with desirable lives, but who mess up a little bit by not being truthful to each other, by being a little bit too promiscuous without protecting themselves. And so occasionally some of them get infected with HIV, and you see then treatment, ARV. So there's a bit of content in terms of negative consequences, but also how to deal with it. A lot of effort of decreasing stigma towards HIV positive people, but all of these embedded in a very typical MTV production. So, you know, the ratings from young people are always very, very high. So what we did was basically work in urban Nigeria. We identified 80 communities within cities where we invited 18 to 25-year-olds, men and women, to watch the screening. Now, this was not done through the regular TV screening, which at the time was not yet done, but we basically set up mini movie theaters. I think I have a picture here. So we used community centers and areas that where we could convene these young people. Or we told them that we were going to provide them food and drinks, and then a raffle for either phones or phone credit. And we invited them to come 3 times. So we bunched the TV series in episodes so that they could come for a total number of 3 times. And people were divided randomly at the center level, so at the community level, into communities that received Suga, which will be our treatment group, and then a control group of communities that instead received another soap opera, very similar, also with Nigerian actors and setting, which is called Giddy Up, but that has no educational message whatsoever. So we had several treatment arms. The first one was basic Suga. So this was supposed to be the closest to what you do if you're watching TV on your own. Of course, they were gathered in a screening center, so maybe it's not the same, but that's what we could do to have the randomization. So treatment 1 will be movie only. The second treatment is what I call the announcement, and it was basically identical to treatment 1, except that after the screening of the episodes, we projected first some interviews with young people saying what they liked, what they didn't like, and then statistics like this. Okay, so we selected a few key variables where we said, suppose you have HIV, would you tell your partner? Okay, now for these variables, we had pre-screening data because when we did the pilot before rolling out the intervention, we actually interviewed viewers after the pilot, and so we could collect their opinions. So the data that you see there are not fictional. They're truthful. They come from communities that are similar to the ones where we intervene. So we show these types of statistics saying, look, we already showed sugar to people like you in nearby communities, and this is what they had to say. Out of 100, 66 said that if they had HIV, they would tell their partner. Now, if I had a prior, then more than 66 would tell the partner. Actually, what we're doing with this slide is going against the effect of sugar, because we're giving them a negative shock in terms of the prior on the community. But if they thought that only 50% would tell their partner, then this is a positive shock. So we collected their priors when we did the baseline, and we can tell for every single individual in our sample whether the message that we show should lead them to update upwards or downwards. Okay? So the specification that I showed you basically will look at the distance between prior and announcement for these variables that we selected. Then we had a third treatment arm where people were allowed to invite a friend to the movie. And this was because we thought that, if you could discuss with a friend, or maybe your boyfriend or girlfriend, the impact would be stronger. And finally, we collected data on a random sample of friends that were not invited to the movie to measure if there were spillovers. So this was done between 2014 and 2015. And I will show you effects that for most variables have a time span of about 6-7 months between baseline or intervention and follow-up. So this is not super long, but it's not short either. Consider that most edutainment evaluations really measure reactions in the 2 weeks after the show. Okay? Also, for some data that we collected on biomarkers, so in health camps, we have basically a 9 or 10 months difference because we collected them in November. So the outcomes come in a variety of forms. Some of them are surveys, so they come from self-reported variables, and these are the ones on knowledge, attitudes, and some behaviors, as well as expectations. For the key outcomes, we also collected objective measures. For example, HIV testing. We gave them a voucher with an ID, and we know whether they redeemed the voucher to get tested or not. We also had them play in a game where they could choose between money and condoms, and this is to see whether their willingness to choose condoms is affected by treatment. And we do not know the results of their HIV test, but we tested for chlamydia, which is a sexually transmitted disease, which is a proxy, again, for unprotected sex. And we aggregate many of these into summary indices, both with averages and with principal. Balance is working well. Let me tell you quickly about treatment effects. So I'm going to show you first these results that regress outcomes in the follow-up on treatment, the interaction between treatment and your baseline outcome, and the baseline outcome itself, plus controls and CT-fix effect. Clustering at the center level, which was the unit of randomization. So first results, knowledge. Okay? So this is an index that includes whether you know, for example, the sources of contagion and transmission, whether you know that you need to take a second test after the first one because there's a window period, and so on and so forth. So you see that both in the full sample and when you disaggregate by gender, the intervention was very effective in improving knowledge. Okay? So the magnitude range from about 0.1 to 0.2 standard deviations. The effects are larger for girls. But it seems that very clearly the first step, that is passing on information, also on somewhat technical aspects, was done well. When you look at attitudes, again, we find these are self-reported, so there might be social desirability bias, and if I have time, I tell you a little bit how we deal with that. But also on attitudes, the show was effective, and here the impact is in the order of 0.1 standard deviation or so. And then on testing, this is quite important because this is an outcome we care about. There was an increase in self-reported testing, and also in this other table, you see the first line is the observed testing. So this is not at all affected by social desirability bias. It comes from our vouchers and health camps. And while the overall propensity to test was very low, in the control group it's about 3%, our treatment doubled it. Okay? So it's true that the magnitude is a 3 percentage points increase, but starting from a very low propensity, it's actually a big effect. Now, this was where things are going a little less well is on outcomes that are not closely related to HIV, but to broader sexual behavior choices. So here our aggregate indices, both in attitudes about what's acceptable and in self-reported behavior, do not show significant effects. Okay? When you look at individual components of the indices, for example, there are some significant effects on promiscuity, and that was an important message. So people are more likely to decrease the number of concurrent partners that they have, which is a risk factor. But one big disappointment, which is this red result down here, is that the probability that you report using a condom last time you had sex is completely unaffected by treatment. And this was a very clear message in the show. Okay? So if there was social desirability bias, if anything, you should report it more. We're not finding it. Also, when we have them play this game, where they can choose money or condoms, while they respond to the relative price, which here is the number of packs offered, let me not get into why, but basically people are rational. The cheaper the condoms, the more likely they are to choose condoms, but not differentially between treatment and control. One good thing, one positive news, has to do with the effects of whatever sexual choices they make. Chlamydia incidence goes down, and significantly so for women. Okay? So it's likely that even though they might not have used condoms more, the reduction in the number of partners or the type of partners that they're choosing basically reduced infection. So let me get in the last hopefully 5 minutes to this 5-10 maximum. 10, Tim is going to shut me off. But let's see, social effects. So we are trying to be thorough in the way we look at these social effects. First of all, I will show you something that's non-experimental, but that uses information on how likely to conform to others an individual is. Okay? Then I will show you experimental variation coming from this announcement treatment, the variation that comes from network exposure with a friend, and finally spillover. So what about conformism? So we included in our questionnaires some standard psychological questions that try to see whether people are likely to willing to restrain their behavior in order not to upset other people. This is what we will call conformity. Then questions that measure whether they are traditional, and this would be behavior that is humble, adheres to religious or customary values, and finally, whether they are self-directed. So these are questions that try to measure whether you're creative, you like to be curious, and to do things your own way. Okay? So what we test is whether treatment has an effect which is the same across the board, or it has an effect which is differential for people who are more conformist or not. So what you see here, the first line is the basic treatment effect, and the second line is this interaction, either with conformity in this table, or with tradition in this other table, or with self-direction. So you can see some stars here and there which go in the expected direction. So for example, if I'm a very traditional person, then my attitudes towards HIV positive people are less positively affected than a less traditional person by the treatment. Or if I'm self-directed, that my propensity to test for HIV or my index of risky sexual behavior improve more because I see it on TV and I rely less on the type of constraints that I might have in the community. But overall, we cannot take this as strong evidence because it's marginally significant and it's here and there. Even weaker, despite all the effort that we put in all these announcements and so on and so forth, is the impact of treatment too. So this is a regression where we are using only treated people and we're comparing T1 and T2. So it's not asking whether sugar worked. This dummy here, T2, is asking whether sugar worked more in the communities where we reinforced it with these announcements. And the answer is no, it didn't. Okay? And even when you look at whether we were going positive or negative with respect to priors, it didn't. Now, to be honest, if you look at short term, so we did some post-screening questionnaires immediately. On those immediate reactions, you do find stars, and you do find them in the direction where you want to see them. So if you look at the immediate response, it's true that these announcements try to lead you in one direction. But when you look at 6, 7 months down the line, as is in this table, then those results don't persist. Finally, watching with friends, no differential effect. So whether I watch alone or with a friend, it doesn't change the impact of the program. Again, the impact stays positive. This is just asking whether it reinforces it. And on the spillovers, we find that people who were not exposed but who are friends of treatment individuals gain in terms of knowledge. So there is some knowledge that is passed on, but not in terms of attitude or testing. Okay? So let me summarize. We found significant effects in the short and long run on knowledge about HIV, attitudes about HIV, and behavior when it comes to testing. So the focus of sugar was HIV, and on this it was largely successful. When we look at sexual behavior and whether you protect yourself or not, the effects are mixed. Self-reported measures and experimental measures of condom use were not affected, but down the line, chlamydia prevalence went down, and the number of concurrent partners were down. So something changed. And finally, on these social effects and spillovers, the evidence is weak. Now, I want to be clear, I don't think this means that they are unimportant. I think it means that the way in which we could manipulate them through our experiment was not enough. In particular, people knew that they were being gathered in these screening centers, but out there, their friends, their families were not watching sugar. So it might be that to really make a change, the scale at which you need to create these reference groups and expose them to edutainment is much higher than what we did. Okay? So what are the open issues? First of all, on content, I don't think there's evidence that tries to experimentally manipulate and see how to deliver it. There are unintended effects, where by selecting some parts of the message, you might have consequences that you were not expecting. And also, to make these programs appealing, you have to put in enough, trash, gossip, intrigue, and so on. And how much are you willing to put up with to increase audience so that you can pass on the message? Also, I won't even mention it because I think it's obvious that propaganda and the border between what is educational and what is ideological is, I think, a big challenge in general for this policy agenda. And finally, time. We don't know how long these effects last for. The best examples, and that's why I showed you non-experimental evidence on Brazil, I think comes from programs that were every day for 6 months or 1 year, and those effects last for years. But when you do these edutainment interventions, they're much more confined in time. So, how long they should run for is another question. So I think overall, it seems to me that this is an exciting agenda. It has the virtue of requiring economists to work with social psychologists, communication experts, and also somehow enlarging a little bit the spectrum of tools that we have available. by no means it should be seen as a substitute to more traditional development policy. I think it's a complement, and so that's what the last picture tries to say. You see books and you see TV. I'm not trying to substitute books for TV. So thank you very much.
So we have a few minutes for Q&A. So if you'd like to put your hands up, if you'd like to ask a question, and there's a roving mic down the front row.
Just a question on sort of disinformation and false messages. So for HIV, there are a lot of misconceptions or outright manipulative messages out there. Did you ever try to target those directly? I'm thinking more generally around fake news and manipulation. What is the evidence on the ability to use this tool?
So what we did was we tried to measure what their baseline knowledge was on, for example, sources of contagion. Many of them think that sharing a bathroom with someone or shaking hands or these types of things might transmit HIV. And there's a lot of other beliefs which have to do sometimes with traditional practices, witchcraft and so on, in many of these areas. But we did not manipulate anything that could be false, because I think ethically you cannot do it. Whether the press or commercial television does it for profit motives, it's another issue. But I think in the educational entertainment agenda, obviously, you can pick which of the positive messages you want to do. You can't do anything that even, maybe with a possibly good goal, would overstate or falsify reality. So I think it's a serious issue, but it's something that concerns more what the baseline knowledge is, in my view, than what the programs themselves generate.
In European countries and US and Canada, young people don't watch TV anymore. So they watch basically shows on iPhones or whatever. So have you thought of doing same kind of experiments, not in less developed countries, but also European countries or American?
So yes, I'm very aware of the fact that this is quite outdated if you look at the, at the large fraction of the world. Working a lot on Africa, I started with television or TV series because that's still quite important there. I would like to, and I think one big advantage of working with those means is that for an empirical economist, it makes it a lot easier to think about randomizing treatment. The challenge with these types of TV series, if you want to evaluate the real thing, is that you cannot randomize. You can encourage people to watch it, but then again, when you encourage, you are making this very salient. So you are not even sure that that would be the effect of watching without anyone telling you, I'm going to call you up and ask you questions. Okay? Now, with these instead phone-based apps and so on, one could very easily deliver content to certain individuals and not others. So I think it would be extremely promising in terms of ability also to manipulate and try different versions. I haven't come up an opportunity to do it, or a topic, or a platform. But in terms of future research, I definitely think it should happen. It's relevant.
Yeah, no, the announcement, the effect of that you were checking, and you're presumably trying to see both people have watched sugar and they get the announcement and what that does. Presumably what you would need to do, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, is have one group that hasn't watched sugar, they just get the announcement, and then check the effect. That way you will know whether it's the combination of sugar and the announcement doing it, or just the announcement. Am I misunderstanding this?
So I think this would have been better. We had only so many treatment arms that we could have. And basically, if we only gave the announcement to people who were watching the other soap, it would sound a little weird, because this other soap was about people trying to get good jobs and make money and so on. And then we come in and say 66% would reveal to their partners. They would think we were very strange. And also, it would clearly contaminate our control group, because suddenly we tell them something about HIV. So we should have done it as a pure kind of, to try and separate the combination. But if it had to be done for the whole control group, we decided not to. So eventually, I think if what you're saying is, could you have embedded a pure information campaign without without sugar or without any soap, just go to people and give them facts, it would have been great. And we thought about it. We ran against power calculations, but yeah, that would have been very
Well, if not, then it remains for me to thank Eliana for a superb presentation. You absolutely sustained the kind of standards of earlier days.
well. It's only the entertaining part of sugar that maybe helped.
But no, it's been fantastic that you were able to come. And since this is the last plenary, let me add my thanks and good wishes. The two more sets of sessions, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. But have a safe journey home. And if you enjoyed the Congress, tell your friends about it. Next time we have one, get them all to sign up and come along. Thank you very much.